Oxford from the inside. The good, the bad, but always the truth.
So, so you said that with modern history is because you don't need to look at the primary text because the secondary text is sort of good enough. Is the reason why in ancient history that's not necessarily the case? Is that the primary text itself is so open to interpretation that you also yourself are allowed to, I guess, put your own opinion on what's being said?
I possibly. I think like there's as you know so much secondary and historical writing about like the ancient period, like so many books about the Roman Empire, but it's that what they're writing about is much smaller in scope in terms of evidence that like it is like possible to like actually get an understanding of it. Whereas like if I was thinking about the French Revolution, like and I want in a kind of primary source way, like how many thousands of like pamphlets, letters, all of these things would I have to grapple with to like confidently write about it at all? So I think it's just more plausible based on the scope of the evidence with ancient history to like, because usually depending on the thing you're studying, there'll be, one or two like main like written sources that apply to it. So like I can feasibly, if I'm thinking about like a particular Roman civil war, it's plausible that I could read like most of the words written in that era about that war. Whereas take any medieval or early modern or modern war, and there's no way I could read that same level of sort of primary source understanding. So I think it's probably more in that.
Yeah, that really paints a quite a vivid picture as well of what I mean, to me at least, how the ancient history is different to modern history in terms of how you'd approach the subject and how much, giving a more vivid picture of how much evidence there is behind both eras. One of my friends who does history, he always said to me that in undergraduate history, you're not. It's rare that you're encouraged to think of your own. I'm gonna word this wrong, but I'll try it. He said that it's rare that you're encouraged to think of your own ideas because that's what researchers or academics do. As an undergraduate, you look at what other people have said and try to answer your essays looking at what other people have said. How true is that, and does that change, and how does that apply to ancient history? Because this is a historian I asked, so I'm just wondering if that changes with ancient history as well.
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I kind of do agree with that. Like, we're undergraduate historians, we're not like breaking new ground. I mean, even in the dissertation, they're like, originality is good. I mean, that I think, like, the most original piece of work you will do as part of your history degree, and originality is like, it's cool if you've got it. I think the job of like an undergraduate historian is to wrap your head around a period of time or an idea or a thing that happened. And by wrap your head around that, it means wrap your head around like what you kind of get the impression like happened, why it happened, what were the consequences, the thing itself. Get your head around like how that was then understood by historians at different times, and maybe why that was. Marxist historians from a time past, and modern historians with new ideas, and the emergence of like gender history and all of this stuff, right? Like it's all just like new lenses on the same stuff. You're just sort of engaging with that. Like you write an essay and it'll be a lot of like, okay, this happened and this is probably why this happened, and I find historian X's version more convincing than historian Y because I believe that these economic factors are more important than ideological factors. And so it's just sort of most essays and papers and things like that, like the biggest component is almost just like responding to the ideas that other historians have put out there. And but that's not to. I don't think this is a disservice, because like academic history is a lot like that. Like people do a lot of their own primary research, but it's primarily to like prop up how they're about to disagree with a different historian. You know what I mean? Like they're all just responding to each other as well in great, decade-long feuds between different schools of historians. So it's not like unrepresentative of what history as a discipline is, except that you're just not required to have this like insane understanding of the primary sources, because there are so many. Additionally, like as part of your finals, like you'll do a dissertation, you might do an extended essay, you'll do like a Gobberts paper, which is a Gobberts paper is where instead of writing essays, you write commentaries on a primary source. And as part of like those kinds of modules, like the importance of understanding of the primary source and like your own original research is like more emphasized than like you might find in first year. And like I did a dissertation, and so I went to an archive and read primary sources and tried to write something that like other people hadn't really written before. How far I did that successfully, we'll find out. But like you do get an experience of that as well, like if you want to, right? Yeah, does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah.
I think we all feel differently, because unlike a science, right, where you have like kind of a rigid structure of lectures and things that you have to understand, and you're always building on other things. With history, like even within the same module, even with the same like subtopic, even with the same essay, there are so many different ways to go about it. It's so like interpretive, and so I'm sure there are history students out there that would have strongly disagreed with what your friend said, because they made like a really conscious effort to have their own understanding of the primary sources and decided that that's how they were going to write all their essays. And I think so. It's like you can make of it what you want.
Nice.
Yeah, varied.
One thing I've heard is that there's like one of the aims of that humanities students try to get out from the essays is independent thought. And how does that? Can you describe us a bit more about what that is in terms of within AMH?
Okay. It's very. I would say that it's very not very different to history, because the modules and how you study the modules are the same. I'd say the only difference is, which is small, is that on some of the kind of like ancient history papers that you do, because of the limitations of the primary source material, and that you can kind of read it yourself, and thus you're not reliant necessarily on other historians all the time, you can sometimes feel like a little bit more free to come up with your own ideas. They would have probably been thought of before and written somewhere else, but sometimes you feel as though you're building an understanding of the period in a way, or with a confidence that maybe you would never build about like 18th century France or 20th century Britain, because there's so much more going on there. Other than that, here I would emphasize that, like in a lot of ways, AMH is so similar to history, and like the day-to-day, the like essays, the reading, the ways of thinking are going to be the same. That's my experience. It's the experience of a lot of the AMHs I know. And I think until you get to the realm of like, as an AMHer picking like Latin and Greek, I think it's going to be true for most of us. So yeah, the difference is slight.
Nice. And more about you. How have you found the course, and can you tell us a bit more about which modules you chose? And then after that, we'll talk about what modules there are available. Which modules did you choose?
So to the first question, I've enjoyed AMH. I think it's a good subject. I like that I could do both, because I always had an interest in ancient history and history that were kind of separate but connected. And like it was one of those things where it's like, oh, it's just the perfect course. Like, sometimes you find it. For me, and I didn't feel ever like burdened or restricted when I was studying. and whilst I study, the module choices there was plenty of variety, and there was enough space for me to do like the amount of ancient history that I wanted and the amount of modern that I wanted. And if there was ever kind of a thing of, you know, like that requirement of, okay, maybe I wanted to do a modern history module, but actually I still needed to do one more ancient to fulfill a requirement, it's worth pointing out that history, like if you just do straight history, there are still sort of requirements on what periods you have to cover. Like you couldn't do all medieval if you did straight history. So if it's a limitation of AMH, it's a limitation of all subjects. There will always be things within a subject that like you do have to do a minimum amount of, or a core thing that everyone has to do. So I never felt sort of hard done by it. No, I enjoyed the subject. I think I had good tutors. The like classics, ancient history tutors are very nice. They're not like snooty towards AMHs, even though, you know, we don't have the language. I imagine they find it a bit refreshing that they can just like not speak in Greek for an hour and that sort of thing. So yeah, AMH is more chill, I imagine, for them, and easy. I actually found the ancient history modules to be easier broadly, as a kind of, I don't want to like meta game the a degree at Oxford, but like it absolutely bumped my grades up a bit to be performing better in the ancient modules than the modern. I think that's, you know, worth knowing. It can seem a bit easier, just because, as I said earlier, there's like less to grapple with often. What did I actually do? Okay, so in my prelims, I sort of did what I more or less outlined earlier, where I did the period of Roman history. My paper, which was European and World, I did the long 19th century, which is 1815 to 1914. And the European and World papers are like general, like Europe and the world, mostly Europe. And you're covering like 100, 200 year period. And then you, within that, pick topics like the economy or political ideologies or sort of place of women in society or ideology around gender or race, right? And then you study it within that kind of time period, doing comparative between different places. My optional subject in first year, the close study, was the French Revolution. So like a little bit of source work, but mostly still not, to be honest. That was a lot of fun. It's your first taste of like doing something in depth rather than like a big broad, you know, 100, 200 year thing. And then I did approaches to history, which a lot of historians do, where you do things like, approaches to history is like how history interacts with other disciplines. So you can do things like history and archaeology, history and sociology, history and economics. They're kind of within that. As for my finals, as I said, you kind of do 7 things. I did another period of Roman history, just kind of following on from the last, quite typical that you will do that. You're just working through the story. I did a dissertation, which I did on, it was a modern history dissertation. It was on the British Mandate of Palestine in the 1940s. So that was sort of archival research based. I did my special subject, which is worth 2 things, was Cicero and the sort of political thought of the late Roman Republic. And so the 2 things are an essay-based exam and a Gobbett's paper that kind of commentaries on a primary source, because it's mostly based on Cicero's writings. I do disciplines, which is the general like historiography module that every historian has to do. I did a further subject, which was on the Middle East and the Age of Empire from 1830 to 1970 odd. And I did another European and World History paper, which was America from independence to after the Civil War. I think that's the 7. Does that sound like 7?
Yeah, that was 7. Nice.
Probably was 7. So those are the 7 parts of my finals. They're all pretty good papers. The dissertation, I think, was the best part by far. Like having your own space to like come up with a project and And it seems really daunting when you start, but like everyone very quickly figures it out, I think. And like you produce something which is like 12,000 words, has primary source, you know, like a set of primary sources, a bibliography. You've come up with the structure, the argument, the drive. You can print it off in a fun, but like it's a really cool part of the degree, I think. And then the papers are just cool.
Nice.
I can give more detail on those papers, but
I was
hours.
I was going to ask, just as the last question, can you give us, if there's too many, then a few of the rundown of the different modules you can take that are part of the ancient history within AMH?
Yeah, for sure. So like one category is the like period of Greek or period of Roman history. There's like the same number of both, but obviously covering different periods. I actually don't know which periods the Greek bit covers, but it will be inevitably older than the Roman. So like 500 BC, right? And then those Roman histories are like, you know, 200 to 100 BC, 100 to 0 BC, 0 to 100 BC, just, you know, segmented. And then, you know, the options for like in finals, like the further and the special, there are papers on like Athenian democracy, on Alexander the Great and his big empire, Cicero and the political thought. There's one that's more architectural, I think. So there's a few more like out there options. Those are there aren't loads. You know, what I've just said probably represents probably like half of what there actually is total. But those are the kind of things, you know, I think as a general point, it's going to be mostly Roman or Greek. So where if you hear ancient history and you want to study like, you know, China at that time or India at that time, then this is not the course for you. It's a very sort of Roman, Greek, the classical Mediterranean world, a little bit of like Alexander and you know, Persia, but mostly Roman, Greek options.
And as a last question, just for someone who's listening and thinking, when they hear you talking about Cicero and that is writing about politics, what would you say to someone who says, how can like political writing in 2000 years ago be applicable now? And how did you find that with studying Cicero?
I mean, it's a fair question. I don't know if I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm someone who would argue that like a lot of this ancient history stuff isn't basically pointless, or not necessarily. The point of it isn't to like apply to modern politics. Like there's other value in academic study and research, but like on that particular point. But like at the end of the day, like it's people. And this is really going to sound really simple, but it's just people doing things. That is all history is at most of the most times, or animals. And so like, you know, it doesn't matter if it's like Robespierre, you know, messing around in Paris in the 1790s, or Stalin in the 1920s, or Caesar in the 40s AD. Like we're still talking about social relationships, power, like economy, like philosophy and ideology, like the core themes and ideas that drive like the study of history are always applicable when there are, again, people doing things. So it's people doing things with a different sort of classical aesthetic. It's still, you know, any sort of application of like modern historical understanding, you can, if you try hard enough, get the same sort of ideas from ancient historical understanding. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it attacks that. There's I imagine lots of arguments for valuing history rather than just the idea of applying it to the present, and that whether it's 100 years ago or 2000 years ago, you should do what you're interested in, and you're interested in what people doing things and just finding where and I mean when, I should say. But yeah, so that's all we've got time for today. That was really interesting. Which, if you listen to all the episodes, I don't actually say that often. But
I mean, I'll check.
That sounds a bit of a stab. I didn't mean to, but no, it was really good. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Arthur. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
And
Thanks for having me.
I know, Miss City. And thanks for the viewers for listening, whether it's on your podcasting platforms or YouTube, Instagram. And yeah, stay safe, stay in tune to our next episode, and we'll see you guys later.